Welcome back to the OFFbit. Today we're looking at the Core 2 Duo E7500. We'll be pairing this CPU with the NVIDIA GTS450. We're going to try and run a few relevant game titles for 2021, and we're going to run a couple of games that this system should be more than capable of running. We'll also do our usual benchmarks and just see what this system can and can't do. So stick around and see how we go with the E7500 and the GTS450. Today we're using an actual real-life built system, though we'll be swapping out the hard drives for our drives so we can do our benchmarking and run our games for this video. We've upgraded this system from 2GB to 4GB of RAM and placed a 128GB SSD. We've ordered a Xeon quad core for this system, but we're still waiting for that to arrive. But anyway, that's future me's problem. So let's start doing our hardware teardown. The CPU we're using today is the Core 2 Duo E7500. The Core 2 Duo E7500 was released in January of 2009 and is based on a cut-down cache version of the Wolfdale architecture, comprising of 3 meg of level 2 cache. Released on the 775 platform, this CPU is based on the 45nm node. This CPU is a 2-core, 2-threaded construction clocked at 2.93 GHz from a 1066MHz frontside bus with a multiplier of 11 times. Producing a TDP of 65 watts and was introduced with a low price of $135 USD. The motherboard we're using today is the Asus P5Q Pro. This motherboard is an LGA 775 motherboard running the Intel P45 Express chipset, supporting max bus speeds of 1600 MHz. It has 4 DDR2 DIMM slots, 2 PCIe 2.0 x16 slots, 3 PCIe x1 slots, and 2 standard PCI slots. This motherboard is a nice example for gaming on the LGA 775 socket-based CPUs. Here we have the NVIDIA GTS450 from Gigabyte. This particular video card is the GV-N450-1GI. The GTS450 was released on the 11th of September in 2010 under the codename GF106. This is a Fermi-based video card with a GPU clock of 783 MHz, comprising of 1GB of GDDR5 RAM clocked at 1804 MHz. Having a TDP of 106 watts, this card does require a 6-pin Molex power cable connected to help with the power delivery. The supported APIs for the GTS450 is Direct3D11 at feature level and Direct3D12. It supports OpenCL 1.1 and OpenGL 4.6. Today we're running a bit of a mixed bag of RAM. We have a total of 4GB of RAM with one set of 2x1GB sticks from Hynix. The other 2 sticks of 1GB RAM are from Corsair and PQI. Each of the RAM modules are rated at 667 MHz, and that's the clock speed we're running at. Finally, the drives we're using. We have our standard 120GB Western Digital Green SSD for our operating system. We have a 256 SP SSD drive for our games, and we also have the 1TB Western Digital Green magnetic drive for some of our bigger games. We'll be running Windows 10 as usual today. Our build of Windows at the moment is build 1909. Now we've gotten through all the nitty gritty, let's see how the hardware compares in the benchmarks. In CPU ID, the E7500 did not do too bad compared to all the other Core 2 designed CPUs. It even tied with the E8400, which has more cache and a slightly higher clock. In the multi-core test, it really does fall behind the 4-core machines, but still does very well against the other Core 2 duos. In 7-zip, the CPU shows a strong single core compared with all the other CPUs, but once again falls behind the E8400 because of the higher clock and having more level 2 cache. In the multi-core, it really does fall behind the 4-core machines once again, and the E7500 sits in between the E6600 and the E8400 Core 2 duos, in which exactly what you would expect. Cinebench R15, the E7500 sat where we expected it to sit, sitting between the E6600 and the E8400 Core 2 duos, but it was more closer to the E8400. Moving on to the NVIDIA GTS450. In Cinebench R15 we scored 38.42 frames per second, putting the card down at the middle lower end of the benchmarks. Now there's a few things to factor in here. We do notice that the AMD cards are actually more favoured in this test, but also the CPU can load or boost depending on how powerful that CPU is on this test. Finally, in Eugene Heaven, the GTS450 scored 332 points, pushing us to the middle high end of our benchmarks, sitting just behind the HD7770 and in front of the HD5850. Now, the positioning of the GTS450 is no surprise. I think it should sit around this spot. It should be faster than a HD5850, but slower than a HD7770. So this is no surprise, as we said. Now, the single core strength gives us some promise for some of the games of today. But if the game needs to use more than 4 cores to perform well, we're going to be in trouble. The NVIDIA GTS450, on the other hand, should do fine in the games with this system. We definitely should be able to run anything that the CPU can run anyway. The proof's in the pudding, so let's jump into our first game. Now, a great go-to game for all you gamers out there who are stuck on older systems, especially a Core 2 Duo platform-based CPU, and that pretty much goes for pretty much all of the repository of most of the Blizzard games. Most of their games do have the ability to play well on older CPUs. So if you have not guessed our first game already, it's Diablo 3. The game gave us a smooth feel in gameplay, with very little frame drops hitting 40 frames per second or lower, at least when we were playing. Really, if you're looking for a great hack and slash that looks amazing and you have a system like this, the GTS 450 and the Core 2 Duo, then you definitely need to try out Diablo 3. Frame rates for Diablo 3, average frame rate of 57.3 frames per second. Our minimum frame rate hit 9.8 frames per second, and the maximum frame rate hit a whole 76.2 frames per second, which is pretty good. Our 0.1% low frame rate hit 1.6 frames per second. Now, if you're on a Core 2 Duo system, this is a game you definitely need to add to your list, especially if you like the hack and slash genre. A new game that we've added to our list of games is World of Tanks. We ran this game at 1920 by 1080 at full details. This game did not miss a beat, pretty much running dead flat at 60 frames per second all day long. The game does have a bit of a dated look to it, but still can give a fun element of gameplay. If you are playing on an older system, then World of Tanks is definitely worth a try. Frame rates for World of Tanks, average frame rate was 59.5 frames per second. Our minimum frame rates hit 57.9 frames per second, with maximum frame rates hitting 60.2 frames per second. Our 0.1% lows hit 31.6 frames per second. So, like we said, this game played perfectly. Moving on to our FPS genre, Overwatch. Now, being another Blizzard game, we decided to throw the E7500 Core 2 Duo into the ring. We ran Overwatch at 1280 by 720 on low settings. The game did run a little slow and did suffer from stutters when things became somewhat busy. Overwatch on this system was far from perfect, but definitely playable. Sure, it's a competitive type game and it really can hinder you when your aiming performance is bungled by lower frames per second. However, with a few more tweaks like dropping back the resolution again or optionally changing the dynamic resolution back a bit, I think you could get something relatively smooth, but you still would have to get used to the more pixel looks and the lack of detail. Average frame rate for Overwatch was 33.9 frames per second. Our minimum frame rate hit 8.4 frames per second. Our maximum frame rate hit 69.9 frames per second. Our 0.1% lows hit 3.6 frames per second. To be honest, this game ran surprisingly well. Though not perfect, still playable. In Valorant, we did run into some struggles. We ran Valorant at 1280 by 720 with low settings. The game did have its smooth parts of gameplay, but it did suffer quite often from load stutter. The CPU was really working hard during this game. Though the game did struggle at times, it still was quite playable. Our frame rates for Valorant were average frame rate of 32.2 frames per second. The minimum frame rate hit 1.9 frames per second. Maximum frame rate hit 52.7 frames per second. Our 0.1% lows hit 1 frames per second. Look, the stats show us basically what we have said. For the most of the gameplay, it runs alright. But you do experience those drops and stutters, and usually that occurs when you need the high frame rates. Yes, in battles. Ouch. But didn't happen all the time. So overall, it wasn't so bad. Our next game is Genshin Impact. Though this game did not run perfectly, it was still playable. We ran Genshin Impact on low settings with a resolution of 1280 by 720. This game has a trick to set lower resolutions at full screen. The trick is, set your desktop PC resolution to the res you want. Now once you've done this, Genshin Impact will be in the resolution at full screen at what you want. I know, it's annoying, but it works. This game really could benefit with a CPU that's better, or probably at least more cores, something like a quad core. Frame rates for Genshin Impact, average frame rate was 32.5 frames per second. Our minimum frame rates hit as low as 0.5 frames per second. As we said, the CPU was struggling here. Maximum frame rates we hit was 60.9 frames per second, and our 0.1% lows hit 0.5 frames per second. Now the data really does reflect the load lag from an overworked CPU. Though we did not experience anything major that would make the game unplayable, and thanks to the nature of the game, it is a little bit more forgiving than others. Though we do worry about bigger battles or bigger cities that it could hinder the performance even more. So yes, this game is playable, but be wary, it may not be in the later parts of the game. Our final game today is another Blizzard title. Yes, Heroes of the Storm. We ran Heroes of the Storm at 920 by 1080 with medium settings. Now the game did have a little bit of stutter in some of the battles. Overall the game did give us a very playable experience, but not perfect though. Frame rates for Hero of the Storm were, average frame rate were 36.5 frames per second, our minimum frame rate hit 0.4 frames per second, and our maximum frame rate hit 66.4 frames per second. Our 0.1% lows hit as low as 0.4 frames per second. Now, the stats do show a fair amount of load stutter in there. With low details and maybe a low resolution, you could probably get a perfect gameplay. But for the most of the gameplay we experienced, we felt that this would not be necessary. However, if you need that competitive edge and you need that extra frames per second and you're playing more intense games, yes, you may want to turn the details back or maybe even upgrade your CPU to give you that better frame rate experience.
Man's gotta do what a man's gotta do.
Now wrapping this all up, the Core 2 CPU these days are certainly on the way out unfortunately, with the absence of new instruction sets that newer CPUs provide and some new games do require. It definitely narrows down the field of games we could try before we even think about factoring in the lower performance of the Core 2 that we have. Also, adding on top of that, the lack of threads that the new CPUs provide, the Core 2 Duo is definitely something that we need to seriously think about upgrading. However, with a careful choice of what games you choose to play, you definitely can still play relevant game titles for today. Which in my books is very impressive, especially firstly with the developers and the choices that they are making to make games more available for more and more people. And secondly, the performance still of the CPU that's 12 years old. That's not bad, really. Now, the next thing we're going to move on to is the GTS450. Now, this card is considered to be old these days, but it still can tussle with some of the newer mid to low-end graphics cards. Once again, with a careful choice of resolutions and games and details that you're setting to, the GTS450 can still run new game titles, though you may need to avoid some of the heavier titles or put up with the slower sluggish frame rates and those stutters that comes with those titles on older hardware. However, this card still can play many games other than those few heavier titles. As we saw today, Genshin Impact, Diablo III, Heroes of the Storm, these games are still widely played and are still getting new content added to them constantly. But overall, unfortunately, the days of the 15-year-old plus hardware support for newer games is certainly coming to a close. Fortunately, there will always be the odd title from main developers and a handful from indie titles that will support the older hardware, and even with the ability to even run them at a playable gameplay rate. Well, that's all we have today for you at the OFFbit. We'd like to thank you all for watching this video today. And if you enjoyed this video, hit that like button. Also, if you have not jumped on the subscribe train yet with us, please hit that subscribe button. And always feel free to leave us a comment. We're always looking ways to add and improve to our content. We also love to keep building our hardware gaming community to help each other out. Once again, thank you for watching, and we'll catch you guys next time on the OFFbit.